Section 15 of the Letters of Jane Austen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 33. Castle Square, Tuesday, January 24th. My dear Cassandra, I will give you the indulgence of a letter on Thursday this week instead of Friday, but I do not require you to write again before Sunday, provided I may believe you and your finger going on quite well. Take care of your precious self. Do not work too hard. Remember that Aunt Cassandra is quite as scarce as Miss Beverley's. I had the happiness yesterday of a letter from Charles, but I shall say as little about it as possible, because I know that excruciating Henry will have had a letter likewise, to make all my intelligence valueless. It was written at Bermuda on the 7th and 10th of December. All well, and Fanny still only in expectation of being otherwise. He had taken a small prize in his late cruise, a French schooner, laden with sugar, but bad weather parted them, and she had not yet been heard of. His cruise ended December 1st. My September letter was the latest he had received. This day 3 weeks you were to be in London, and I wish you better weather. Not but that you may have worse, for we now have nothing but ceaseless snow or rain, and insufferable dirt to complain of. No tempestuous winds nor severity of cold. Since I wrote last we have had something of each, but it is not genteel to rip up old grievances. You used me scandalously by not mentioning Edward Cooper's sermons. I tell you everything, and it is unknown the mysteries you conceal from me. And, to add to the rest, you persevere in giving a final E to invalid, thereby putting it out of one's power to suppose Mrs. E. Lee, even for a moment, a veteran soldier. She, good woman, is, I hope, destined for some further placid enjoyment of her own excellence in this world, for her recovery advances exceedingly well. I had this pleasant news in a letter from Bookham last Thursday, but as the letter was from Mary instead of her mother, you will guess her account was not equally good from home. Mrs. Cooke had been confined to her bed some days by illness, but was then better, and Mary wrote in confidence of her continuing to mend. I have desired to hear again soon. You rejoice me by what you say of Fanny. I hope she will not turn good for nothing this ever so long. We thought of and talked of her yesterday with sincere affection, and wished her a long enjoyment of all the happiness to which she seems born. While she gives happiness to those about her, she is pretty sure of her own share. I am gratified by her having pleasure in what I write, but I wish the knowledge of my being exposed to her discerning criticism may not hurt my style, by inducing too great a solicitude. I begin already to weigh my words and sentences more than I did, and am looking about for a sentiment, an illustration, or a metaphor in every corner of the room. Could my ideas flow as fast as the rain in the store closet, it would be charming. We have been in 2 or 3 dreadful states within the last week, from the melting of the snow, etc., and the contest between us and the closet has now ended in our defeat. I have been obliged to move almost everything out of it, and leave it to splash itself as it likes. You have by no means raised my curiosity after Caleb. My disinclination for it before was affected, but now it is real. I do not like the Evangelicals. Of course I shall be delighted when I read it, like other people, but till I do, I dislike it. I am sorry my verses did not bring any return from Edward. I was in hopes they might, but I suppose he does not rate them high enough. It might be partiality, but they seemed to me purely classical, just like Homer and Virgil, Ovid, and Propria que maribus. I had a nice brotherly letter from Frank the other day, which, after an interval of nearly 3 weeks, was very welcome. No orders were come on Friday, and none were come yesterday, or we should have heard to day. I had supposed Miss C. would share her cousin's room here, but a message in this letter proves the contrary. I will make the garret as comfortable as I can, but the possibilities of that apartment are not great. My mother has been talking to Eliza about our future home, and she, making no difficulty at all of the sweetheart, is perfectly disposed to continue with us, but till she has written home for mother's approbation, cannot quite decide. Mother does not like to have her so far off. At Chawton she will be 9 or 10 miles nearer, which I hope will have its due influence. As for Sally, she means to play John Binns with us, in her anxiety to belong to our household again. Hitherto she appears a very good servant. You depend upon finding all your plants dead, I hope. They look very ill, I understand. Your silence on the subject of our ball makes me suppose your curiosity too great for words. We were very well entertained, and could have stayed longer but for the arrival of my list shoes to convey me home, and I did not like to keep them waiting in the cold. The room was tolerably full, and the ball opened by Miss Glynn. The Miss Lances had partners, Captain Dauvergne's friend appeared in regimentals, Caroline Maitland had an officer to flirt with, and Mr. John Harrison was deputed by Captain Smith, being himself absent, to ask me to dance. Everything went well, you see, especially after we had tucked Mrs. Lance's neckerchief in behind and fastened it with a pin. We had a very full and agreeable account of Mr. Hammond's ball from Anna last night. The same fluent pen has sent similar information, I know, into Kent. She seems to have been as happy as one could wish her, and the complacency of her mamma doing the honors of the evening must have made her pleasure almost as great. The grandeur of the meeting was beyond my hopes. I should like to have seen Anna's looks and performance, but that sad cropped head must have injured the former. Martha pleases herself with believing that if I had kept her counsel you would never have heard of Dr. M.'s late behavior, as if the very slight manner in which I mentioned it could have been all on which you found your judgment. I do not endeavor to undeceive her, because I wish her happy at all events, and know how highly she prizes happiness of any kind. She is, moreover, so full of kindness for us both, and sends you in particular so many good wishes about your finger, that I am willing to overlook a venial fault, and as Dr. M. is a clergyman, their attachment, however immoral, has a decorous air. Adieu, sweet you. This is grievous news from Spain. It is well that Dr. Moore was spared the knowledge of such a son's death. Yours affectionately, J. Austen. Anna's hand gets better and better. It begins to be too good for any consequence. We send best love to dear little Lizzie and Marianne in particular. The Portsmouth paper gave a melancholy history of a poor madwoman escaped from confinement, who said her husband and daughter, of the name of Payne, lived at Ashford in Kent. Do you own them? Letter 34. Castle Square, Monday, January 30. My dear Cassandra, I was not much surprised yesterday by the agreeable surprise of your letter, and extremely glad to receive the assurance of your finger being well again. Here is such a wet day as was never seen. I wish the poor little girls had better weather for their journey. They must amuse themselves with watching the rain drops down the windows. Sackree, I suppose, feels quite broken-hearted. I cannot have done with the weather without observing how delightfully mild it is. I am sure Fanny must enjoy it with us. Yesterday was a very blowing day. We got to church, however, which we had not been able to do for 2 Sundays before. I am not at all ashamed about the name of the novel, having been guilty of no insult toward your handwriting. The diphthong I always saw, but knowing how fond you were of adding a vowel whenever you could, I attributed it to that alone, and the knowledge of the truth does the book no service. The only merit it could have was in the name of Caleb, which has an honest, unpretending sound. But in Colibs there is pedantry and affectation. Is it written only to classical scholars? I shall now try to say only what is necessary. I am weary of meandering. So expect a vast deal of small matter, concisely told, in the next 2 pages. Mrs. Cooke has been very dangerously ill, but is now, I hope, safe. I had a letter last week from George, Mary being too busy to write, and at that time the disorder was called of the typhus kind, and their alarm considerable. But yesterday brought me a much better account from Mary, the origin of the complaint being now ascertained to be bilious, and the strong medicines requisite promising to be effectual. Mrs. E. L. is so much recovered as to get into the dressing-room every day. A letter from Hamstall gives us the history of Sir Thomas Williams's return. The Admiral, whoever he might be, took a fancy to the Neptune, and having only a worn-out 74 to offer in lieu of it, Sir Thomas declined such a command, and is come home passenger. Lucky man, to have so fair an opportunity of escape! I hope his wife allows herself to be happy on the occasion, and does not give all her thoughts to being nervous. A great event happens this week at Hamstall, in young Edward's removal to school. He is going to Rugby, and is very happy in the idea of it. I wish his happiness may last, but it will be a great change to become a raw schoolboy from being a pompous sermon writer and a domineering brother. It will do him good, I dare say. Caroline has had a great escape from being burnt to death lately. As her husband gives the account, we must believe it true. Miss Murden is gone, called away by the critical state of Mrs. Pottinger, who has had another severe stroke, and is without sense or speech. Miss Murden wishes to return to Southampton if circumstances suit, but it must be very doubtful. We have been obliged to turn away Charles, he grew so very drunken and negligent, and we have a man in his place, called Thomas. Martha desires me to communicate something concerning herself, which she knows will give you pleasure, as affording her very particular satisfaction. It is that she is to be in town this spring with Mrs. Dundas. I need not dilate on the subject. You understand enough of the whys and wherefores to enter into her feelings, and to be conscious that of all possible arrangements it is the one most acceptable to her. She goes to Barton on leaving us, and the family remove to town in April. What you tell me of Miss Sharpe is quite new, and surprises me a little. I feel, however, as you do. She is born, poor thing, to struggle with evil, and her continuing with Miss B. is, I hope, a proof that matters are not always so very bad between them as her letters sometimes represent. Jenny's marriage I had heard of, and supposed you would do so too from Steventon, as I knew you were corresponding with Mary at the time. I hope she will not sully the respectable name she now bears. Your plan for Miss Curling is uncommonly considerate and friendly, and such as she must surely jump at. Edward's going round by Steventon, as I understand he promises to do, can be no reasonable objection. Mrs. J. Austen's hospitality is just of the kind to enjoy such a visitor. We were very glad to know Aunt Fanny was in the country when we read of the fire. Pray give my best compliments to the Misses Finches, if they are at G.M. I am sorry to find that Sir J. Moore has a mother living, but though a very heroic son, he might not be a very necessary one to her happiness. Deacon Morell may be more to Mrs. Morell. I wish Sir John had united something of the Christian with the hero in his death. Thank heaven, we have had no one to care for particularly among the troops, no one, in fact, nearer to us than Sir John himself. Colonel Maitland is safe and well. His mother and sisters were of course anxious about him, but there is no entering much into the solicitudes of that family. My mother is well, and gets out when she can with the same enjoyment, and apparently the same strength, as hitherto. She hopes you will not omit begging Mrs. Seward to get the garden cropped for us, supposing she leaves the house too early to make the garden any object to herself. We are very desirous of receiving your account of the house, for your observations will have a motive which can leave nothing to conjecture, and suffer nothing from want of memory. For one's own dear self, one ascertains and remembers everything. Lady Sondes is an imprudent woman to come back to her old neighborhood again. I suppose she pretends never to have married before, and wonders how her father and mother came to have her christened Lady Sondes. The store closet, I hope, will never do so again, for much of the evil is proved to have proceeded from the gutter being choked up, and we have had it cleared. We had reason to rejoice in the child's absence at the time of the thaw, for the nursery was not habitable. We hear of similar disasters from almost everybody. No news from Portsmouth. We are very patient. Mrs. Charles Fowle desires to be kindly remembered to you. She is warmly interested in my brother and his family. Yours very affectionately, J. Austen. End of Section 15.